In the Bible, there are several verses on disability. One of my favorites just so happens to come from Matthew chapter 15, verses 29 through 31. And it says, Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet. And he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And they praised the God of Israel. Disability rights are rights for a person with a physical or mental impairment, and they are unable to perform certain activities on a daily basis, but they are also not limited to what they can and cannot do. This now brings me to my topic, which is disability rights. Amendments and acts created just for anyone with disabilities. Illinois was impacted positively during the 1960s and early 2000s by the disability rights movement and the Americans with Disabilities Act. The disability rights movement started during the 1960s and sparked many disability advocate groups and people with disabilities demanding equal rights and equal opportunities. This fight led to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed by George W. Bush officially as a law in 1990. And it states that it is unlawful to discriminate against those with disabilities. The disability rights movement used the strategies of protest, filing lawsuits, and not resisting arrest allowed residents of Illinois to know that if they protest, file lawsuits, and not resist arrest, that their lives would become better than they would hope. Although there was much controversy with the ADA's definition of disability, the movement in ADA can be identified as trusted resources for the improvements of many lives. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was involved in the fight for disability rights. He was an advocate for disability rights, and he was also the very first U.S. president who had a disability. During a family vacation in 1921, he contracted polio, or poliomyelitis, which is an infectious viral disease that affects the central nervous system and can cause temporary or permanent paralysis. Polio caused him to lose strength in his legs, which made him become paralyzed. In order to regain strength back into his legs, he went for a few swims at the Warm Springs, Georgia resort. And after going back several times, he decided to buy it, which he then called the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation, which was a foundation that created water treatments for anyone else who also had polio like himself. George W. Bush was also involved in the fight for disability rights. He signed the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, in 1990 to officially become a law. He wanted everyone who had a disability to be able to be equal with those who do not have a disability. Edward Verne Roberts was also involved in the fight for disability rights. He was an American disability rights advocate, and he is also the founder of the Independent Living Movement, which combined advocacy, resources, and education toward the goal of the disabled living independently and fully integrated with the abled society. He founded the Independent Living Movement because he wanted people who were physically and or mentally impaired to be able to live comfortably. When he was 14, he contracted polio, just like President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it left him paralyzed from the waist down. However, he didn't allow polio to stop him from doing the things that he wanted to do.
Well, we're here to protest the Obama administration's complete disregard for the rights of people with disabilities to live in our own homes and communities.
There are events, processes, and ideologies that happened during the 1970s and early 2000s which are helpful to understand disability rights. An event occurred in the 1970s where disability rights activists marched on Washington so that people with disabilities could have a voice in the 1972 Rehabilitation Act. A process that happened was in 1975 when the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed, and it stated that all rights and needs of children, infants, and families of children with disabilities are to be protected. An ideology that happened was when the Architectural and Transportation Barriers Compliance Board made ways for public housing and public transportation for people with disabilities. The theme of Chicago History Fair 2017-2018 is conflict and compromise. Conflict and compromise relates to disability rights because the lives of those who are disabled in any way, shape, or form and who may be physically and or mentally impaired have improved greatly. At one point in time, CTA buses and trains were not suitable for anyone who's in a wheelchair or is unable to sit in the seats that are provided for them. To improve this, there are now movable seats and belts, harnesses, ramps for anyone with a disability. They can now ride public transportation comfortably, and they won't feel as if they're being a burden to abled people.
The first thing that comes to mind when I think of disability rights is IDA laws that allow students to be mainstreamed in the general education setting as well as being included in all classes regardless of their disabilities. Important the role that I play here teaching diverse learners because they can learn just as anyone else can, and being able to have everyone realize that as well as understand the importance of everybody learns in different ways, and it is my job as a teacher to meet each student and teach them to the best of my ability.
My definition of disability rights is anybody that has a physical or mental incapability that can do the same activities and other things as regular people.
I love that aspect of Westinghouse, so I think that something that makes Westinghouse really special is that we're diverse in literally every metric that you can think about, and the fact that we have a low incidence program is really an addition to the school community. It lets people interact with people that aren't like them and people who are unfamiliar, but really get to know them and create real relationships. So it's one of my favorite aspects of the building, and I know some older schools don't have, they don't have the physical, I don't know what you call it, capacity to host students, and I really like that we are a newer building, and so we literally can welcome any student in, and we know that they can get to a music class and they can go to anywhere in the building and be a part of the Westinghouse community. So I love it.
The Americans with Disability Act, also known as the ADA, was the act that was signed by President George W. Bush on July 26, 1990. The ADA states that it's against the law to discriminate those with disabilities in public lives, transportation, jobs, schools, and everywhere that is open publicly and privately to everyone. There are two sources in which discusses disability rights. Jim Simpson discussed how Kim Walker used her pain to help others. William Cheslowski discussed how families with loved ones who had pain also helped others with disabilities. These sources were relevant towards the ADA because they each explained how different people wanted to ensure that people with disabilities were not being discriminated against in both public and private manners. Although there are many similarities between those who were involved in the disability rights movement and the ADA, there are also discrepancies. In an online chat board, someone posted a comment saying ADA laws have been interpreted, reinterpreted, and misinterpreted so many times that unfortunately nobody has a final answer until you end up in court. This says that due to the ADA being controversial at one point in time, it has ended with someone going to court behind it. There are also discrepancies between two historians. Tanya Tishkovsky, who is an associate professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, argued in her book, The Question of Access, that people with disabilities are often looked at as if they don't belong, and why they should have equal rights and opportunities. She said, using the idea of access as a starting point as to how disability can be rethought challenges readers to critically question their own perceptions of disability and access. What I got from this statement was that she wants her readers to really ask themselves, what do they think of disability and access, and what does that mean to them?